So last year was very much for charities a year where the issues were political. Things like the pipelines, environmental activism by charities, and last year's federal budget, which, as it related to charities, was dominated by political matters. So it was a very political year, and it was a little bit unexpected that that would be the case. And I guess what I want to do today is talk about how charities can do political activities, how it's important that they do it, and go through basically some of the rules that relate to charities doing political activities. So my first good idea is that political activities are often a vital way to accomplish your charity's objects and serve your beneficiaries. There are many things that you simply would not be able to do if you did not get involved in the political realm if you're a charity. So if you take the example of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they want to stop people from driving while intoxicated. It would be hard to do that without having the criminal code deal with that issue, and that's a political issue. If you think about things like acid rain, it's hard to deal with it by just educating big companies about the problem. Sometimes you need to actually have caps and deal with things in legislation. If you want to deal with, for example, major international development issues, things like maternal child health, yes, you can ask people to donate to charities, but in fact, getting money through government programs is very important. Things like community economic development, dealing with poverty, public health, all sorts of different areas that charities touch on. You can do some work outside the political realm, but often if you want to have a long-term lasting impact, you need to consider your charity being involved in some political activities. Now, when the word political comes up, a lot of people have a certain negative feeling about that. I want to point out that in most cases, actually, political is very much a win-win. It's good for the charities to get involved. It's good for politicians who are interested in many cases, not always, but in many cases, in good public policy. And charities know a lot about public policy, and so it can really be a good thing. Often we think of political as being contentious or even toxic sort of issues. And I just want to assure you that 99% of political stuff is not that. There is some of that, and some members of parliament and others like that sort of stuff, but most are repelled from it and want to actually try and do things where charities can provide some good input. So some things simply will not be able to be done unless there is government agreement, acquiescence, legislation, that sort of thing. The other thing is that governments are important. The resources they spend, obviously, are very important. If you just look at the charity sector, with our $210 or so billion in revenue for the whole sector, only $13 billion of that comes from fundraising. And the rest of the money comes either from earned income or government. In fact, over $120 billion of that money comes from government. So almost 70% of the money that charities have come from government. We're talking about hospitals, universities, social welfare agencies, international development, things like that. Some groups get everything from fundraising. But if you look at the whole big picture, 70% from government. The way I see it is governments have, and increasingly it's scarce resources in terms of funds, and especially in this climate of wanting to have low taxes, you're going to have less resources for government to have. So the question really is, are charities going to be at the table where the decisions are made about how those scarce resources are going to be dealt with? Or is it going to be purely, well-represented business corporations that are going to be at those tables? The tables are still going to take place. The discussions will still take place. The only issue is, will charities be at the table? And that's a choice that charities have to make. There's no question that other interests that are not necessarily in the public interest, but maybe in their own personal or business interest, will be pushing government in all sorts of directions, and charities also need to put their input in as well. To the extent that we feel that charities should get more government money, or at least that there shouldn't be cuts, that's a very political issue, but it's, I would say, an extremely important issue for charities. The way I see it is, if governments of all levels cut charitable funding by 10%, just by 10%, we would need to fundraise 100% more money to make up that difference. Okay? And I don't think anyone, not even if all the fundraisers were trained by Ken Wyman, would we be able to achieve that result? At least not within the next 2 or 3 years. Maybe Ken will be able to do something in the longer term. So the second point I wanted to make was be selective about when and how to become involved in political activities and plan carefully. Essentially, charities, if you're a registered charity under the Income Tax Act, you have objects. These objects are set out in your letters patent or in your articles of association, articles of incorporation. That's the box that you can operate within, the objects. Then charities have missions, because if your object is to relieve poverty in Ontario, that's a lot of stuff that you could do. But what is your mission? What are you really going to focus on? And the same thing with political. You need to prioritize. You need to think through. There's a lot of issues going on. And if you just get involved with something because, you know, in the old days it used to be it would arrive on the fax machine, oh, sign this petition, get involved with this issue, now it's by email, and there's a lot of this stuff going on. If you get involved with a lot of things, then the likelihood is you're not going to do it very well. You should prioritize what you get involved with and also ask yourself, is it within your objects? If it's not within your objects, you really shouldn't be involved with it as a charity. As an individual, you can get involved with what you want, but not as a charity. And then also, do you have the knowledge? I've often seen charities jump on a bandwagon because one well-respected group has come up with a particular position that really wasn't that well thought through, but then others think, or they just assume it's well thought through, and they sign on, and then 3 months later they're like, well, we shouldn't have actually properly supported that. It wasn't actually in the best interests of our constituents and what we were looking for. The most important asset that most charities have is their reputation. It isn't what's in their bank account or their investments. It's a reputation. And you don't want to do things in a way that is going to really destroy that very important asset. The other thing I suggest is when being selective and working out how to get involved in political activities is charities ideally should have a policy. It could just be 1 page long, but a policy on when do you get involved with political activities. It sets out a procedure. Maybe the board has to decide that this is something that's appropriate. Maybe the executive director has to decide. Right now, it sounds like whoever's manning the Twitter account is making the decision, okay? And so one should just be careful about that. And you should realize that there are some real risks, and I don't want to underestimate that, and especially for organizations that get a lot of money from government. To do a lot of political activities, especially if it's going to be controversial types of political activities, can put you in a somewhat precarious position. So you need to think through those risks. You also want to avoid the fray of partisan political activity. This is something that politicians don't even understand. They talk about how on the one level, charities are not allowed to be involved with partisan political activities, but yet they try all the time, just as a natural human instinct, to get charities to support what they're doing. And you know, sometimes they'll ask questions of people, for example, where the way they're asking the question and the way they want the question answered is going to be a criticism of another political party. Well, that is clearly inappropriate to do that. So the point is, and this was more, I think, an issue in the past with a minority government, there was a real a desire by some people to get involved with all the little things going on that were probably best for charities not to get involved with. The other thing is you've got to be careful what alliances and coalitions you get involved with, especially where some of the members of that alliance or coalition are not registered charities themselves, or they don't understand the intricacies of the rules that apply to registered charities. So I think that many groups should look at these alliances because the alliance is as good as the weakest link. And all it takes is one group within the alliance saying things on behalf of the alliance that can put the whole group in jeopardy. And so it's important that if one wants to be on a solid base when you're involved with political activities, that you're very selective about what you get involved with and make sure that you deal with it carefully. Now I want to give you a quick overview of what charities can do when it comes to political activities, because I think that if I spoke to most people in the charity sector, their initial reaction is charities are not allowed to be involved in political activities at all, which is not correct. Essentially, there's a couple references on that sheet of paper you have. The first 2 references, one is to a document called CPS 22, which is CRA's guidance on political activities, which came out in 2003 and was recently, in a very minor way, revised. And that is the main document. If you're trying to understand how do charities deal with political activities, look at CPS 22 as the place to start. And then there's, I think, a very important document that came out about a year and a half ago called Upholding Human Rights and Charitable Registration, which talks about the issue of human rights organizations and how, in fact, much of what they do is charitable and not political. So very important document. Those two documents are the central documents. But the basic rules for Canadian charity is you're allowed to carry on political activity as long as you're generally spending less than 10% of your resources on political, that it's connected to your objects that you have, and it's not allowed to be at all partisan, so it has to be non-partisan. And then the other thing is that when you're doing it, it should be informative, accurate, and well-reasoned, and not false, inaccurate, or misleading. So those are the basic parameters if you want to, as a charity, conduct political activities. So an activity, because I often get asked the question, is this allowable for a charity to do this? And then this usually is like a sentence or two, and I say I need like 5 pages is what I need. Because you can have an activity that is prohibited, allowable, or you change a little bit, that activity could become a charitable activity. So one has to actually break it down. Prohibited activities, what are charities forbidden to do? First is illegal activities. So organizing a riot would be an example of an illegal political activity. Also partisan activities that I mentioned. You can't be doing things that either directly or indirectly are done to support a political party or a candidate who's running in an election. So prohibited, you have to avoid completely. Allowable, these are the activities that you can do that are connected to your object, that are within the 10% of resources. And if you're a smaller organization, under 200,000 in revenue, you can actually do more than 10%. Something that also isn't often known, but you can also average out over 3 years. So if you spend nothing on political, and then another year nothing on political, and then the following year some big issue comes up and you spend 20% on political, CRA would look at the previous years and average it, and there's a number of concessions, if you will, that CRA makes that can mean that in some cases you are spending more than 10% and it's allowable. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are, I think very surprising to many people, huge areas where the CRA considers things that are obviously political, but they consider them to be charitable and not political. The main one I can think of is the idea of if you go as a charity to meet with a member of parliament or a government official, in general they would consider that to be a charitable exercise as opposed to a political exercise, which is sort of surprising because that is probably the most political thing you can imagine that a charity would do, and for most charities that is about as sophisticated as they're going to get, is going to meet the member of parliament and discussing an issue of concern to them. CRA does not consider that to be political. However, that's very different than, for example, telling your members you should write to the member of parliament about an issue. That is political. So explicitly communicating a call to action would be political. Or explicitly communicating to the public, so not to a member of parliament, but to the public, that a law or policy needs to change would be considered political. And so political is fine, but only within your 10%. Okay? Also, if you explicitly indicate in your materials, say you're doing a research report and you're talking about in this research report how we're trying to do this research report because we're trying to change the government policy on a particular issue, otherwise we wouldn't be doing this research report, well then that becomes a political thing. Whereas if the research report was done just to research an issue, and then later you came up with a proposal as to how maybe that should be dealt with, the research report might have been a charitable initiative as opposed to a political initiative. And the fourth angle that one keeps in mind when it comes to political is something that came out of the recent budget, which is if a charity gives money to another registered charity, and you explicitly say this is to be used for political purposes, that's also considered a political expenditure. Okay? Now, if you give money to another charity, just as a gift, and that charity happens to spend some money on political, that is not your issue. You don't have to clock that as political. But if you're giving it and it's explicitly either in writing or not in writing, but it's understood that money will be spent on political, you need to include it in your political, and the charity spending it would include it in its political. So just a few other little rules that you should keep in mind when it comes to the issue of political. One is allocation. And a particular activity could have multiple purposes. It could be partly fundraising, partly political, partly charitable, and in some cases you should allocate. You should also keep good enough books and records with, it applies to everything charities do. It's not good enough to do good work. You need to be able to document the work that you've done so that if you're audited by CRA, then you have the necessary documents to show what you've done. In the case of CRA, what I say when it comes to the whole issue of record keeping and books and records is that you're always going to have to keep books and records to whoever is the most demanding stakeholder that you have. So if you could potentially be audited by CEDA, and they could ask for copies of certain things that maybe CRA isn't even interested in, you need to keep it. If there is a requirement you have to report to a funder quarterly, then you have to be able to keep records in a way that you can do that. CRA only requires really the annual reporting on the T3010. So in fact, for many organizations, the easier part of their reporting is to CRA, and reporting to some funders or donors can be much more complicated. If you want to do more than 10%, a charity has to look at CRA's guidance. They actually set out how one can do more than 10%. Basically, it can't be the charity itself, but others can, and in this world it's pretty easy. If some volunteers want to get involved in something that's very political, they shouldn't do it as part of the charity. They can set up another organization, and it can do, and nonprofits can do 100% political if they're not a registered charity. So the moral of the story is, this isn't about your freedom to engage in the political process. This is about restrictions that are on registered charities under the Income Tax Act to be involved with political issues. And I think Ratna mentioned that the 10% issue. I would just point out that, and this I guess gets to my next point, which is be transparent about the political activities to protect your registered charity status and your reputation. So according to, just to take 2009 as an example, 465 charities said they did political activities. That's 465 out of 86,000. They said they spent $18.6 million. Now, if we work off the numbers of $200 billion for the revenue of the charity sector, 10% of $200 billion is $20 billion. Now, they said the charity sector spent less than $20 million, okay? So how much more could we spend and stay within our 10% if every charity spent its 10%? 1,000 times more, to be precise, okay? So when I hear that CRA is the main impediment to charities doing political activities, I don't know what to say. Charities can spend a lot more on political activities, but I would also point out that the figures, what people put on their T3010, in my mind, it's probably the worst filled out line on the T3010 was, do you do political activities and how much do you spend? So CRA has recently just put out a new T3010, just in the last couple of weeks, with basically an additional page of questions that deal with political activities. And it's interesting, and I wrote a whole article on this. The article's called How Accurate Are the T3010 Charity Return When It Comes to Political Activities? And I basically go through why, for many reasons, charities have not in the past been very good at answering this question, including confusion by charities as to what is political. They think political means partisan political, and no, they don't get involved with that. So there's all sorts of reasons why they haven't filled this in correctly, but this right now for the next year or two is going to be something that CRA is going to be focusing tremendous attention on. Last year's budget dealt a lot with political, including allocating $8 million to CRA to audit charities on political activities, which means that a lot more charities will be audited on these issues. Also, there'll be a lot more education of charities. I'm quite happy that there'll be more education of charities, because I think after 2 or 3 years of being educated by CRA, charities will know that you are allowed to do political activities. You just have to do it within the rules. Okay? And so I'm confident that in a few years' time, we will have a charity sector that's more engaged in political activities and doing it better, more transparently, and I think it's important. But I would point out that of the charities that said they spent money, only 122 said they spent over $10,000 on political activities. So this doesn't indicate to me a huge commitment on the charity sector part to being engaged in the political process. Okay? So that takes me to my fifth point, which is to build the capacity you need and allocate sufficient resources, which is really the central problem. We can blame CRA, we can blame, I guess, Stephen Harper, we can blame whoever we want, but really the reason that charities don't get involved in political activities in many cases is they don't want to allocate the funds for that. They don't have people who are comfortable dealing with these issues in many cases. Charities sometimes have silos, and the board may be afraid of getting involved in political activities. It's interesting that I would say most charities don't understand the regulatory rules around political, so that's why it's easy for them to say, oh, we're not allowed to do political. That's a good way to not have to worry about doing political, is just say it's illegal to do it. And of course, you can always quote from some senator who says that it's illegal for charities to do it. But then as we see, the standard for getting in the Senate isn't that high. So there are many challenges for charities who want to get into political. It's also that many donors and supporters are not happy with your charity getting involved with political, or sometimes government funders, especially if what you're getting involved with is something which is very critical of the government. They may have some issues with that. But let's face it, a lot of charities don't get government money, or they're prepared to give up that government money. And in fact, many cases, charities that are criticizing government are also getting government money, so it's not like it's an impossibility. And I think also it's a question of that in some people's mind, political has a very negative connotation. Charities right now have 77% trust amongst the public, according to the polling that's been done by Ipsos Reid. 77%. Politicians have a trust rating of about 15%. Okay? Lawyers, I think it's probably quite a bit higher. Maybe it's like 16 or 17%. The point basically is that if you get involved with a lot of political activities, there is a worry that charities will be, their level of trust in the public's mind may come down. But on the other hand, charities, if they're careful about it, they do it well, they can reap huge rewards from being involved in the political process. And ultimately, if you want to deal with really big issues like hunger, healthcare, things like that, and you want to deal with it on a long-term basis, there's a lot to be said for Canadian charities getting involved with political activities. So I want to conclude my sort of formal comments by just suggesting about 10 or 12 things that charities can do if they're interested in getting involved in political activities. The first one would be look at your legal objects. I know for many organizations this is something they probably haven't done in 20 or 30 years, but look at what you actually were set up with. And for many, if you're an Ontario corporation or a federal corporation, there's changes that are happening right now to corporate legislation in this country, in Ontario and federally, that mean that you can change your objects if you want to as part of that process, and you can consult with CRA about those changes. But first, understand what your objects are. And this isn't your mission or your vision. This is your legal objects that if you're a registered charity, you're set up with. Number two, look at whether you do political activities. Don't look to the T3010 to know whether you do political activities, because that was probably filled in incorrectly in previous years. But look to, what is the definition of political activities and that sort of thing. Look at whether your stakeholders, your donors, your supporters, your board, your employees, your volunteers, etc., are interested in getting involved in political activities. And by the way, that can change. Your group may have no interest in being involved in political activities until the marsh that you've been protecting for the last 30 years is about to be obliterated by one development project, okay? So you can go from 0 to 60 very quickly. If your board doesn't have anyone who understands any of these issues, then that's a board composition issue. Maybe you need to put a couple people on the board who do understand these issues. And maybe the board as a whole needs education on these issues. Also, what process or policy do you have on getting involved in political activities? I'm not suggesting you just get involved in political activities every time something interesting comes in on the email. I'm suggesting that you be very careful actually when you get involved and only do it when it's a real priority area for your charity. Are sufficient resources allocated for political? That's a big problem, and it's one of the central issues for many organizations, that really no resources are allocated for this, and that's a problem. What percentage of your expenses is political? If you're spending 10% on political, then you've got to think in terms of structure and how do you operate. But for many organizations, they're not spending anything on political, and therefore they can only spend more than they are currently spending. If your charity wants to do more political activities, it's a matter of, well, then how do you get the funding for it? There are some funders who are interested in political activities. They're interested in systemic change, long-term. And then there are other people who only want to hand out, you know, blankets to homeless people. That is what they want to do. And there's nothing wrong with, if a person wants to just do that, that's fine. However, that is not going to deal with homelessness in Canada on a long-term, sustainable way. Do you have a disbursement quota excess? If you are not even meeting your disbursement quota, then you should not be involved with political activity. Are your political activities correctly reported on the T3010? And I can say that in most cases the answer is not. Because when Imagine Canada did a very interesting survey that I write about in that article I referenced earlier on the T3010s, they asked Canadian charities, do you do political activities? And they specifically listed the types of political activities that are referenced by CRA. 37% said yes. So 37% of charities are saying yes to Imagine Canada, but about 0.5% are saying yes to CRA on the T3010, okay? The other thing to keep in mind is that it's not just if you're a charity about CRA. If you're doing a lot of work with paid staff people on political, you may have to do lobbyist registration, either at the federal, provincial, municipal level. So just keep that in mind. There are other regulations other than the Income Tax Act. And then the final thing I would just point out in terms of positioning a charity for political and just generally, or positioning it not to be involved in political, is watch your social media. Because I think there's often a disconnect between what the board thinks is going on in a charity and what's happening on their Twitter account or Facebook account. And I think that often, and some charities are very careful and the people are really knowledgeable who are dealing with social media about what the limits are. But in some cases, that's not the case. Things are being forwarded and retweeted and other things that may not be appropriate for a charity to retweet it. Okay? So basically, these are just some suggestions for how charities can be more involved in the political process. I think, Katarina, we are going to now have people discuss amongst themselves, is that right? What thoughts you guys have on the subject. And then we will come together again, I guess, in what, about 10 or 15 minutes? In about 15 minutes' time, and have a discussion.